In this video, I'll tell you about how to make your kit bashing projects better without any extra skills or even much work. I've been getting into kit bashing more and more lately, which is taking parts from different miniature kits and then sort of bashing them together, usually with glue. You don't actually bash them, but you're sticking them together. And I don't mean like kit bashing Warhammer models, right, to make them look like fancier Warhammer models or anything like that, or repositioning limbs or sculpting new details with like green stuff and all those things. Those things are great, don't get me wrong, but sometimes, and I think for me it's most times, kit bashing is more fun when you do more kind of simple tweaks and changes to a model to make it into a different model. But why change a miniature? There are probably millions of miniatures out there to choose from between physical models and STLs for 3D printing, and there's probably one that looks just how you want it to look somewhere out there. Two things. Number one is that actually there might not be a model out there that looks exactly like how you want it to look, even if there are potentially millions of miniatures out there. And number two, why search for and then buy a new miniature that looks how you want when you could instead use the bits from miniatures that you already own and aren't using, and then make a miniature that looks how you want? And you also get to save money, and you also get to have fun, and more importantly, tell the story that you want to tell. That's the thing I'm really enjoying about kit bashing lately, telling the stories that I want to tell with the miniatures that I create. I used to just change things to change things, when kit bashing, to make a model look different, but that's not the right way to kit bash, at least in my opinion. Trying to make a model that tells the story that you want gives you a great guiding principle in what parts and pieces you choose for your kit bash, rather than just, grabbing a Space Marine model and doing a simple head swap. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing a simple head swap, by the way, if it fits your story. So I've had this current idea kind of rolling around in my head for weeks now. I want a robot of some sort, but I want it to be in kind of medievalish armor. I want to use it in, miniature agnostic sci-fi skirmish games, of course, because that's what I'm into, right? Games like Space Weirdos and stuff like that. The idea in my head is that this, very highly technological robot, right? Something that it's almost kind of skeletal and scary, like the Terminator from the James Cameron movies and stuff like that. It loves medieval literature and stories. I don't know why, but it just does, right? It's either an experiment that got away from its designers, the robot itself, or maybe it deserted from some sort of military force, but now it wants to be a knight. But our robot friend here is also not a moron, and it knows that an old-timey sword, isn't going to serve it very well in spaceports and on border worlds and stuff like that. So it's still going to carry a gun and probably a knife for close-up interactions. Robots don't really need money, really, but they do need supplies and such, and probably repairs and things like that. So I assume that this robot might get some kind of work as a sketchy bounty hunter, or maybe a gun for hire. All of that doesn't really matter to the build itself. That stuff's more things to think about later on when putting this robot into a group of other models to make a warband. I figured that this robot would either build this armor itself, right, or have it built for them. But I didn't want it to look like all janky and handmade, like let's say orc armor or something like that. I wanted it to look exquisite and almost fantastically crafted, something that would actually be really inconvenient and difficult to wear, like you couldn't sit in it or anything like that, more so than actual historical plate armor, which wasn't actually as difficult to wear as some might think. But lastly, I wanted the robot's head still sticking out of this armor, with no helmet on. I wanted it all to be like a knight, and then with a gun, and then just robot head, both to show the viewer kind of like the dichotomy of the robot in plate armor kind of idea, and also because the robot understands that it still needs its full suite of sensors. So I figured it was best to start with the fancy armor. I had a few different, kinds of knight type models to look at, but a lot of them were Stormcast Eternals, and they didn't really feel realistic to me. None of them are really quite what you would call medieval, right? They're much more fantastical than historical. I did have a few kind of historical models from the time period that I was kind of targeting, and while some weren't actually, models of knights, they were mostly foot knights and not like in plate, right? They'd be great for other projects, but not for this one. Then I remembered a model that I bought at Adepticon earlier this year. It's one of those kind of commemorative series Games Workshop models that they put out and only sell at big conventions like Gen Con and Las Vegas Open and Adepticon. It's a Cities of Sigmar model called the Steel Rook, and it's wearing some straight up ridiculous plate armor, which will definitely fit the bill for this project. I went online to just check and see how much the model was going for before I defaced my copy, right? And eBay was selling it between $70 and $80 on average, although I found one place selling it for $250. I decided to cut it up anyway. I don't buy miniatures as an investment, I buy them to use them. Now, at this point, I needed to find the gun that I wanted to use and the knife as well, and probably a head, but I kind of had an idea where to look for that within my collection. This model initially is holding kind of a war pick in its right hand, resting on its shoulder, and it has a dagger in its left hand, which may or may not be attached to its belt. It's kind of difficult to tell. I wanted to find a very utilitarian knife, like maybe like a Space Marine combat knife, but I wanted the gun to be something slightly more weird and almost old-timey looking. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about old-timey space guns, I think Adeptus Mechanicus. Most of their guns have a nearly kind of steampunk look to them, which would fit well here with what I wanted to do. Therefore, with these kind of general targets in mind, I started digging through loose sprues that I keep in plastic tubs when I don't know what to do with them. That's always a good place where I have a tendency to start. Even though I had ideas about roughly what I was looking for, it was a very good idea to keep an open mind in case, you come across something that will work better, perhaps. I collected up all the sprues that had parts that I wanted to try and brought them over to my hobby table. I knew I needed to start by building the knight and then start kind of removing the parts that I wanted to replace as I went. I also knew that I didn't want to use like the weird integrated base between his feet and also the bird on a branch that was attached to the, that weird thing between the knight's feet. GW doesn't normally do that stuff. They usually keep things like that separate so you can choose to use them or not, right? But this case was different, so I had to cut all that away from his feet. I did keep the bird on the stick, though, for use in other projects, of course. I find it useful to eyeball the parts that I want to replace, kind of put one in front of the other, check the size and all that kind of stuff, even if they're, still on the sprues, just to make sure that they'll work. I also find it easier to kitbash as I go, as opposed to building a model first completely and then kind of cutting the parts away afterwards. With more modular models, that seems obvious. However, this knight is a monopose sculpt, so you could think it's better to build it as they kind of expect you to do and then modify it, but in most situations, kitbashing as you build the main model is best. It's always best to save the pieces you're going to cut away, like this knight's helmet. It won't work for this story that I'm trying to tell with this model, but it's a great helmet that could be pretty awesome on a different model in the future. The gun I finally decided on was this kind of cool AdMech pistol with kind of a plasma gun sort of vibe to it, and I really wanted to use the whole robot arm, perhaps, that it was attached to, but the weapon was being held in the left hand, and I wanted it in the guy's right hand, so it was actually just better to cut away the hand and the grip on the pistol and then glue it directly to the knight's hand. Most hands holding a melee weapon, like this war pick, can also hold a gun if you cut them right and glue everything together and believe in yourself. This one worked even better because the pommel of the war pick kind of looked like a weird bottom of the pistol grip on this weapon when all glued together and it was all said and done. Sometimes you get these happy accidents, as Bob Ross used to call them, when you're kit bashing, and it's just better to go with them. Remember, you're creating this thing to tell your story, and it doesn't have to make perfect sense if you don't want it to. With most of the build done, it was then time to figure out the head. I had an idea that I wanted a near skeletal kind of robot head, like I said at the beginning, But during my search for parts, I found a few other heads I thought about trying as well. Using a tiny little bit of poster putty to hold them on, I tried a few other ones. This Grey Knight head was kind of interesting, but it was also, I think, way too big and made the figure look almost like chibi style, if you know what I mean, which was not what I was looking for. I also tried a sci-fi trooper head from Wargames Atlantic, but it just didn't really fit the vibe as well as I wanted once I saw it on. This is why you dry fit the parts as much as you can, because what's in your mind might seem right, but you can't really make the judgment until you see it in place with your eyes. That's how I knew, after digging through my collection of resin heads from Puppets War, that the skeletal robot idea I initially had was the right idea all along. After deciding that, I glued the head on, beat up the armor a little bit with a pin vise and going at it with my X-Acto blade a little bit, added some more pouches and like a cool skull on the front. I want to paint it actually as an actual skull, which will be intimidating to humans that the robot comes across. And then it was time to paint. Now, this video is about kit bashing, not so much about painting. There are lots and lots and lots of painting videos out there for you to check out, some that I've even made. So I'll stop with the kind of step-by-step and just show you some of what I did while I talk about the overall vibe. I wanted the metal to look grungy. I almost always like things grungy, so I airbrushed some darker metallics with then a little bit brighter silver as a highlight over the black primer that I started with. I base coated the model's, the base, to make it stand out early from the base itself. When the model and the base are the same color for a long time in the early stages, it sort of bothers me, so changing the base color to what it's going to be eventually right away really helped. As the armor was already base coated and highlighted to some degree in the airbrushing stage, it was time to paint other parts of the model. All the pouches that I added, I wanted the robot to carry a lot of supplies and whatnot on his belt. And then of course the gun, and then the head, and the skull on the breastplate as well. Because this stuff was all sprayed with metallics during the airbrushing, I needed to give them all non-metallic base coats so then I could go forward from there. I wanted the armor to be weathered, but the airbrushing was just the beginning. I started using a selection of speed paints from the Army Painter in different warm colors, a decent amount of like lighter browns, a few darker kind of brown greens, to stipple and glaze in the recesses of the metallic areas of the armor. Again, to make it look grungy, right? You can go as far with this as you feel. I probably waste a bit too much time on this step, if I'm honest, but I enjoy it, and even if no one else can tell what I did, I can tell what I did. And remember, folks, you're always painting for yourself. I did some dry brushing with Army Painter plate mail metal, which seemed kind of apropos on armor like this, to sort of bring back a bit of glint and detail to the weird feathered armor parts of this robot. I lightly dry brushed the gun as well. I wanted it to seem like it was originally black, but again, worn, so you saw some metal on the edges. I just went through with each remaining piece and then painted them. The skull on the breastplate, the robot skull on the, on the robot. I wanted the robot skull to be very different from the metal of the armor. I almost wanted it to look plastic, It was cool grays instead of warm metal tones. I highlighted up both skulls, the robot skull and the human skull that it wears on its armor to scare us humans, and then worked on the plasma part of the plasma pistol. I even painted the eyes on the robot, which I don't usually do, and then finished up the base. It was a pretty quick paint. I spent about just under 3 hours total on it, and that was, with me messing about with too much glazing and weathering that no one will ever notice, and then of course also the filming part as well. I took some risks on colors with this project, kind of stepped out of my comfort zone, and I'm mostly happy with the result. Did the kit bash, at the end, tell the story I wanted to tell? I think so, yes. I see this figure as a lost robot trying to be something it's not, a medieval knight wandering the lands and righting wrongs. Admittedly, it's probably doing this by hunting humans, and maybe aliens, for money, so it can repair its armor and replenish its ammunition. This is all probably part of a weird, programming glitch inside the robot. That's what makes the story interesting to me. Remember, if you come up with the story you want to tell before you start picking parts, you'll probably be happier with the result in the end. Do you think that you'll give a kit bashing project a try soon? What kind of story are you trying to tell? Do you have tons of finished kitbashed models all brimming with story, or are you just simply trying to make cooler looking Space Marines? Let us all know down in the comments below. Also, get 5% off from the Army Painter website with the code in the description. It's also down there as well. If you like this video, while you're down there doing all that stuff, commenting and such, hit the like button. It helps us with the algorithm and gets the video out in front of more people. If you want to see more videos like this every single Friday, again, while you're down there, hit the subscribe button. It's free. Thanks for watching.